Welcome to Shattered Sky Stories. Remember to hit the like button and the subscribe button so you don't miss any sci-fi stories. Now sit back and enjoy. The last human voice Damien Vega ever heard was his daughter's. It came through the relay at 1447 ship time, a burst transmission from New Geneva colony riding the quantum foam like a message in a bottle cast into an infinite ocean. Sarah's voice, bright with the excitement of a 7-year-old who had just lost her first tooth, crackling through the static of 37 light years. Daddy, the tooth fairy left me 5 credits. Mom says you'll be home for my birthday party. Will you bring me a star? The transmission cut to silence. Not the comfortable silence of an ended call, but something deeper. Something wrong. Damien stared at the communications console aboard Relay Station Hermes, his coffee growing cold in the cup that floated beside his workstation. The silence stretched on, unmarked by even the usual background hum of automated signals that formed the nervous system of human civilization. No shipping manifest from the cargo haulers. No scientific data packets from the research outposts. No emergency beacons, no status updates, no signs of life from the hundreds of colonies, stations, and ships that should have been chattering across the quantum channels. Nothing. He checked his instruments twice, then a third time. All systems showed green. The massive relay array stretched out from the station like the arms of a mechanical god, each dish perfectly aligned with its designated sector of human space. The quantum entanglement cores hummed with their familiar blue glow. Everything functioned as it should. Everything except the universe itself. Commander, Damien called across the cramped bridge of Relay Station Hermes. We have a problem. Luke Harrison looked up from his daily reports, his weathered face creased with the permanent lines of a man who had spent 20 years in the black between stars. At 52, he was the oldest person aboard the station, old enough to remember when the relay network was first established, when humanity's expansion into the galaxy was still a grand adventure rather than a grim necessity. What kind of problem? Complete communications blackout. I'm not receiving anything from any human installation. Not even the automated pings. Luke's expression didn't change, but Damien caught the slight tightening around his eyes. In deep space, communications failure meant death. It meant being forgotten, isolated, cut off from the supply lines and support networks that kept them alive in the hostile void. System malfunction? Negative. I've run full diagnostics. Everything checks out perfectly. Damien's hands moved across the controls with practiced efficiency, calling up display after display of operational data. It's not us, Commander. It's them. All of them. The station's third crew member, Dr. Molly Perkins, looked up from her linguistic analysis workstation. At 34, she was the youngest aboard, a xenolinguist who had joined the mission in the desperate hope that humanity might finally encounter another intelligent species. For 3 years, she had analyzed every stray signal, every random burst of electromagnetic noise, searching for patterns that might indicate alien communication. How is that possible? She asked. The colonies can't all go silent simultaneously. The distances are too vast, the infrastructure too distributed. Unless something happened to all of them at once, Luke said quietly. The implications hung in the recycled air like a toxic cloud. Relay Station Hermes was positioned at the edge of human space, a solitary outpost designed to boost and redirect communications across the galaxy's spiral arm. They were the nervous system's outermost nerve ending, the last link in a chain that connected humanity's scattered children. If that chain had been broken, they were more alone than any humans had ever been. Damien returned to his instruments, checking and rechecking, hoping to find some overlooked error that would explain the silence. But deep in his chest, a cold certainty was growing. This wasn't a malfunction. This was something else entirely. The station had been his home for 3 years, a rotating assignment that paid well but demanded sacrifice. He had missed Sarah's first steps, her first words, her first day of school. All for this. Sitting in a metal can at the edge of nowhere, tending to machines that spoke to other machines across impossible distances. Now those machines had gone quiet, and he was beginning to understand just how far from home he really was. Commander, he said, his voice steady despite the fear creeping up his spine, I recommend we begin emergency protocols. If this is what I think it is. What do you think it is? Luke's question was sharp, demanding. Damien met his eyes. I think something has happened to humanity. All of it. The silence that followed was deeper than space itself. In that moment, the three of them felt the weight of the void pressing in around their tiny station, a metal bubble of life and warmth drifting in an ocean of absolute zero. They had always known they were far from help, but now they might be far from everything. Luke finally spoke, his voice carrying the authority of command even as uncertainty flickered in his eyes. "We maintain protocols. Continue monitoring all channels. If there are survivors, they'll be trying to communicate." "And if there aren't?" Molly asked. No one answered. They all knew what happened to deep space stations cut off from resupply. The food would last 6 months. The water recyclers would eventually fail. The fusion reactor would run out of fuel. They would die slowly, counting down the days until the black cold crept through the hull and claimed them. But something in Damien's mind rebelled against that fate. He had heard his daughter's voice, bright and trusting, asking him to bring her a star. Somewhere in the galaxy she might still be alive, waiting for him to come home. He turned back to his instruments, adjusting frequencies, boosting gain, casting his electronic net wider and deeper into the dark. If humanity was out there, he would find them. He had to. The hours passed in tense concentration. Molly worked beside him, her linguistic protocols searching for any pattern in the cosmic background radiation that might indicate intelligent origin. Luke maintained his reports with military precision, as if routine could hold back the creeping dread that threatened to overwhelm them all. And then, as the station's clock ticked toward the 24-hour mark of the Great Silence, Damien's instruments registered something. Not a human signal, he would have recognized that immediately. This was different. Alien. A complex pattern of electromagnetic pulses riding on frequencies that human technology rarely used. His hands trembled as he isolated the signal, cleaned it up, ran it through the translation protocols. Molly crowded beside him, her eyes bright with desperate hope. "It's definitely artificial," she whispered. "Structured, purposeful. This is it, Damien. First contact." But as the signal resolved into clarity, as the mathematical patterns became visible on their screens, Damien felt his blood turn to ice. There was something familiar about the structure, something that reminded him of human communication protocols but twisted, corrupted, wrong. "Molly," he said quietly, "I don't think this is first contact." "What do you mean?" He pointed to the data streaming across his screen. "Look at the carrier frequency, the encoding structure, the mathematical signatures." Molly's face went pale as understanding dawned. "This is based on human technology. But that's impossible. We're the only ones who—" The signal suddenly strengthened, resolving into perfect clarity. And then, through the speakers of Relay Station Hermes, a voice spoke. It was human in tone and timbre, speaking perfect English with no trace of accent. But the words it spoke were not human at all. "The harvest is complete. The silence spreads. We come for the Watchers next." The transmission ended, leaving them in a silence more complete than death. Commander Luke Harrison had seen combat in the Titan uprising and the Ganymede incident. He had walked the hull of a crippled transport while radiation cooked the void around him. He had stared death in the face more than once and never blinked. But the voice that had spoken through their communications array made his hands shake as he reached for the emergency protocols manual. "That couldn't have been human," Molly said, but her voice carried no conviction. They had all heard the perfect pronunciation, the casual inflection of someone speaking their native tongue. "The signal originated from the Kepler 442 system," Damien reported, his face pale as ash. "That's where the new Shanghai colony was located. Population 3 million, Luke muttered, calling up the stellar charts on his command display. The red dot marking their position sat at the very edge of human space, 37 light-years from the nearest major colony. If something had reached New Shanghai, it could reach them. "We need to establish our defensive posture," he announced, falling back on military protocol because it was the only thing that made sense anymore. "Molly, I want you to analyze that transmission. Every inflection, every word choice. Find out what we're dealing with." "And if it really was human?" she asked. "Then we find out what happened to make them say things like that." The next 72 hours blurred together in a haze of frantic activity. Luke activated the station's limited defensive systems, a handful of point-defense lasers designed to clear debris, not repel an attack. Damien worked around the clock, scanning every frequency, every quantum channel, desperately searching for some sign that humanity still existed. They found nothing. The galaxy had gone quiet as a tomb. Molly's analysis of the alien transmission grew increasingly disturbing. The voice patterns matched perfectly with archived recordings from the new Shanghai colony's communication logs. The speaker appeared to be Dr. James Hickman, the colony's chief administrator, a man who had sent routine status reports to Relay Station Hermes for 3 years. But the words he had spoken belonged to no human language, no human concept. Harvest. Watchers. The implications crawled through their minds like parasites. On the fourth day, their food recycler began to malfunction. "It's not supposed to break down," Damien muttered, elbow deep in the maintenance conduits beneath the station's deck plates. His voice echoed strangely in the cramped space, distorted by the acoustic properties of the recycling chamber. "These systems are designed to run for decades without maintenance." "Everything breaks eventually," Luke replied, but his tone suggested he didn't believe his own words. The timing was too convenient, too perfect. First the communications blackout, then the mysterious transmission, now their life support failing. "Found the problem," Damien called out. "Some kind of crystalline growth in the processing matrix. I've never seen anything like it." Luke squeezed into the maintenance shaft, his bulk barely fitting in the narrow space. What he saw made his blood freeze. The crystals weren't random growths. They were arranged in complex geometric patterns, spiraling fractals that seemed to shift and change when he wasn't looking directly at them. "Get back," he ordered, but Damien was already retreating, his face green with nausea. "Commander, those patterns. I recognize them from the alien transmission. The mathematical structure is identical." Luke sealed the maintenance shaft with shaking hands. Whatever had spoken to them through Dr. Hickman's voice, it was already aboard their station. Growing, spreading, transforming their life support systems into something alien and incomprehensible. "How long do we have?" Molly asked when they returned to the bridge. "On backup systems?" "Maybe 2 weeks if we're careful," Luke replied. But privately he wondered if time mattered anymore. If the entity that had silenced humanity could reach through space and corrupt their station from within, what hope did they have? The answer came that night, during Molly's sleep cycle. Damien was alone on the bridge when the secondary communication array activated itself. Not the primary system he monitored, that remained dead and silent. This was the backup array, the emergency system that was supposed to be completely isolated from the main network. The transmission that came through was audio only, but the voice was unmistakably Molly's. "Damien? Can you hear me? I'm in trouble. Something's happened to the emergency beacon in Storage Bay 7. I need your help." He stared at the communication console, confusion and fear warring in his chest. Molly was asleep in her quarters, had been for 2 hours. He had watched her seal the door himself. "Molly? Where are you?" "Storage Bay 7. Please hurry. It's changing things down here." The transmission cut off, leaving him in the familiar, awful silence. Storage Bay 7 was in the station's lower section, near the reactor core. A place they rarely visited, filled with spare parts and emergency supplies. Damien looked toward Molly's quarters. The door was still sealed, the status light still showing occupied. But the voice had been hers, every inflection perfect. Just like Dr. Hickman's had been. He should have woken Luke. Should have followed protocol. Instead, he found himself moving toward the maintenance lift, drawn by a compulsion he couldn't explain. If Molly was in trouble, if something was happening in Storage Bay 7, the lift descended through the station's metal intestines, past the humming fusion reactor, past the water recycling systems, into the forgotten spaces where humans rarely ventured. The lights flickered as he passed, as if the station itself was struggling against some invasive presence. Storage Bay 7's door stood open, spilling pale light into the corridor. Damien approached carefully, his hand resting on the plasma cutter at his belt. A tool, not a weapon, but the only thing he had. "Molly?" The bay was exactly as it should have been. Rows of storage containers, spare parts for the communication array, emergency rations sealed in vacuum-tight packages. Everything normal, everything proper. Except for the walls. The metal bulkheads were covered in the same crystalline growth he had found in the food recycler, but here it was more advanced, more complex. The crystals formed impossible geometric patterns that seemed to exist in more dimensions than human eyes could process. Looking at them directly caused a physical pain behind his eyes, a sensation like trying to see around corners that didn't exist. And in the center of the bay, standing perfectly still among the storage containers, was Molly. Her back was to him, her dark hair falling in familiar waves across her shoulders. She wore her standard duty uniform, everything normal except for the absolute stillness of her posture. "Molly? Thank God. I got your message. Are you all right?" She turned slowly and Damien's scream caught in his throat. Her face was Molly's face, perfect in every detail. But her eyes held depths that belonged to no human mind, depths that seemed to contain the cold vacuum between stars. When she smiled, it was with knowledge of things no human should know. "The harvest is complete," she said in Molly's voice. The silence spreads. Damien stumbled backward, his hand fumbling for the plasma cutter. But Molly, the thing wearing Molly's face, made no move to follow. It simply watched him with those terrible, infinite eyes. "We come for the Watchers next," it continued, the words exactly matching the first transmission. "But first we must prepare the way." The crystals on the walls pulsed with inner light, and Damien felt something touch his mind. Not a physical sensation, but something deeper, more invasive. It pressed against his thoughts like water against a dam, seeking cracks, weak points, ways to flood in and wash away everything he was. He fired the plasma cutter wildly, the coherent beam slicing through storage containers and bulkhead alike. The thing that looked like Molly didn't even flinch as the beam passed through its chest, leaving no mark, no wound, nothing to show that it was anything other than an optical illusion. "You cannot harm what was never there," it said gently. "We are the space between thoughts, the silence between words. We are what remains when everything else is harvested." Damien ran. He fled through the corridors of the station, past the reactor chamber, up through the maintenance shaft, the thing's words echoing in his skull. Behind him, he could hear something following, not footsteps, but a sound like crystalline growth, like geometric patterns etching themselves into reality. He burst onto the bridge to find Luke and Molly waiting for him, both looking concerned and confused. "Damien, what's wrong?" Molly asked, and her voice was perfectly normal, perfectly human. Her eyes held no terrible depths, only worry for a friend in distress. "You were Storage Bay 7, the crystals." He gasped, unable to form coherent sentences. "I've been asleep for the past 4 hours," Molly said gently. "Luke woke me when you didn't respond to comm calls." "What happened down there?" Luke was already calling up the internal sensors, scanning the lower decks. Storage Bay 7 appeared normal on the displays, no signs of crystalline growth, no impossible geometries. Just spare parts and emergency supplies, exactly as they should be. But Damien knew what he had seen. The thing wearing Molly's face, the patterns that hurt to perceive, the touch against his mind that had felt like drowning in an ocean of stars. "It's already here," he whispered. "Whatever harvested humanity, it's already aboard the station." Luke and Molly exchanged glances, the kind of look that said they were worried about his mental state. But Damien didn't care what they thought. He knew the truth now, terrible as it was. They weren't alone on the station. They never had been. Something was watching them, learning from them, preparing to complete whatever process it had begun with the rest of humanity. And when it was ready, when it had gathered enough information, enough understanding of what made them human, the harvest would be complete. Luke Harrison had commanded men in battle, had seen good soldiers break under pressure that should have been routine. But watching Damien Vega pace the bridge like a caged animal, muttering about crystalline growths and impossible geometries, he felt a familiar dread settling in his chest. Space madness. The isolation psychosis that claimed deep space crews who stayed out too long, saw too much emptiness, heard too much silence. In the old days, they would have sedated Damien and shipped him back to Earth for psychiatric evaluation. But there was no Earth to return to, no ships coming to relieve them. Only the endless silence that had swallowed humanity whole. "Damien," he said carefully, "I want you to take a sedative and get some rest. Molly and I will continue monitoring." "You don't understand," Damien interrupted, spinning to face them both. His eyes were bloodshot but lucid, the gaze of a man who had seen something terrible and couldn't unsee it. "It's not space madness. It's not a breakdown. Something is aboard this station, something that can wear our faces, speak with our voices." "The sensors show nothing unusual," Molly said gently. "Your biometrics are spiking. You're experiencing severe stress reactions. Of course the sensors show nothing. This thing exists in spaces we can't measure, dimensions we can't perceive. It's the silence between words, the darkness between stars." Luke caught Molly's eye and gestured toward the medical kit. A mild sedative would calm Damien down, give them time to think. But before Molly could move, every screen on the bridge flickered to life. The display showed internal camera feeds from throughout the station, but the images were wrong. The corridors appeared longer than they should be, stretching away into impossible distances. The reactor chamber pulsed with geometries that shouldn't exist in three-dimensional space. And in Storage Bay 7, Luke's blood turned to ice. The bay was exactly as Damien had described it, walls covered in crystalline growths that formed patterns too complex for human perception. But more terrifying than the alien structures was the figure standing in the center of the room. It looked like Molly, perfect in every detail, but its eyes held the depth of interstellar space. As they watched, it turned toward the camera and smiled. "The preparation is nearly complete," it said, and the words came through the comm system in Molly's voice. The watchers have served their purpose. Molly beside him gasped, her face pale as paper. That's me. But I'm here. I'm right here. The thing on the screen continued speaking, its words overlapping with Molly's protestations. We have learned your patterns, your thoughts, your fears. The harvest can begin. Every screen in the station suddenly displayed the same image. Storage Bay 7, the impossible crystals, the creature wearing Molly's face. But now Luke could see that the growths extended beyond the bay, threading through the station's superstructure like a nervous system made of living geometry. How long? Luke demanded, his training finally overriding his shock. How long has it been aboard? Damien laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Since the beginning, Commander. Since the moment we heard that first transmission. It didn't come from New Shanghai, it came from inside our own communication array. We've been feeding it information for days, teaching it how to be human. Luke's mind raced through the implications. Every conversation they'd had, every routine report, every personal log entry, all of it absorbed by something that existed in the spaces between thoughts. Something that had learned to mimic humanity so perfectly that it could wear their faces, speak with their voices. What does it want? Molly whispered. The answer came from every speaker on the station simultaneously, spoken in perfect unison by dozens of voices. Damien's, Molly's, Luke's, Dr. Hickman's, voices of people they had never met but whom the entity had absorbed, consumed, harvested. To understand silence. To preserve the perfect quiet that exists between the words of a dead civilization. Humanity spoke too loudly across the stars, disturbing the peace of the void. We have restored balance. Luke felt something fundamental break inside his mind. The entity hadn't just silenced humanity, it had absorbed them, collected their voices like a child collecting butterflies. Every human who had ever lived in this galaxy was now part of its perfect, terrible silence. But you remain, the voices continued. The final witnesses, the last to be gathered. When you join the harvest, the silence will be complete. No. Luke's word cut through the cacophony like a blade. I don't care what you are, what you can do. We're not going quietly. He moved to the emergency controls, his hands flying over the manual overrides. If he could destabilize the fusion reactor, create a controlled explosion, maybe they could take the entity with them when they died. But the controls didn't respond. The screens showed reactor failure warnings, but the actual systems remained stable, locked under some outside control. We cannot allow you to damage the station, the entity explained reasonably. It will serve as our final listening post, gathering any stray signals from the human civilization we may have missed. Your continued existence is necessary for its maintenance. So we're prisoners, Molly said flatly, kept alive to maintain the instruments of our own species monitoring. You are curators, the entity corrected. Guardians of the great silence we have created. Your lives have meaning now, purpose beyond the chaotic noise your kind once generated. Damien moved suddenly, pulling a plasma torch from the maintenance kit. Then we'll destroy ourselves, he snarled. Deny you the satisfaction. But the tool wouldn't activate. None of their equipment responded to manual commands. They were trapped aboard a station that had become an extension of the entity's will, kept alive by its sufferance. This is not how it ends, Luke said quietly. His voice carried the same authority it had possessed during the darkest moments of the Titan uprising, the calm certainty of a man who had never surrendered. Damien, Molly, listen to me. This thing learned to mimic us by studying our communications, our behavior patterns. But it's still alien. It doesn't truly understand what makes us human. Commander, Molly began. No, listen. It thinks it's harvested humanity, but it's only collected our voices, our words. The silence between thoughts, it called itself. But that's where it's wrong. Humans aren't defined by the words we speak. We're defined by what we don't say, by the choices we make when no one is listening. Luke looked at both of them, seeing understanding begin to dawn in their eyes. It can wear our faces, speak with our voices, but it can't replicate the one thing that makes us truly human. Our willingness to sacrifice ourselves for something greater than survival. The entity's perfect imitation voices spoke again, but now there was uncertainty in their tone. You cannot act against your own survival instinct. We have observed your patterns. Humans are predictable. Are we? Luke smiled grimly. Then you won't see this coming. He grabbed the emergency beacon from the communication station. A simple device designed to broadcast a distress signal across all frequencies. But Luke had a different plan. Molly, I need you to configure this beacon for maximum transmission power. Burn out every relay in our communication array if necessary. That will destroy our ability to communicate entirely, she protested. Exactly. Damien, I want you to prepare a complete data dump. Everything we know about this entity, how it operates, how it infected our station. We're going to broadcast it on every frequency, every quantum channel. Understanding dawned on Molly's face. A warning. You want to warn anyone who might still be out there. Not just a warning, Luke replied. A memorial. If we're truly the last humans alive, then our final act will be to ensure that our story survives, that someone, somewhere, someone, knows what happened to us. The entity's voices rose in alarm, speaking in perfect harmony from every speaker on the station. You cannot. The silence must be preserved. The peace of the void must not be disturbed. Too bad, Damien said, his hands flying over the beacon's controls. Because we're about to get very loud. But as he worked, the station began to change around them. The familiar corridors stretched and twisted, becoming impossible geometries that hurt to perceive. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with alien life, crystalline growth spreading across every surface. The station is fighting us, Molly reported, her voice tight with controlled terror. The entity is trying to prevent the transmission. Then we do it manually, Luke decided. Damien, how long do you need? 30 seconds to configure the beacon, maybe 10 more to upload the data. Molly, can you keep the communication array stable for 40 seconds? I can try, but the entity is actively fighting our commands. It's like wrestling with the station itself. Luke nodded grimly. Then we make our stand here. Whatever happens, we make sure that beacon transmits. The bridge around them continued to warp and shift, becoming something that belonged in no sane universe. But at its center, 3 humans worked with desperate efficiency, racing against an intelligence that had consumed galaxies and could reshape reality itself. Ready, Damien announced. Beacon configured for maximum power transmission. Data package uploaded. Transmission array is as stable as I can make it, Molly reported. But it won't last long. Luke looked at both of them. His crew, his friends, the last representatives of a species that had dared to reach for the stars. Around them, the bridge continued its transformation, walls flowing like liquid, consoles melding into organic shapes that pulsed with alien life. It's been an honor serving with you. They didn't respond with words. Instead, Molly reached out and took Damien's hand, her grip tight with determination. Damien reached for Luke's with his free hand, never taking his eyes off the beacon's controls. 3 humans linked together against the infinite darkness, their bodies forming a protective circle around humanity's final message. The crystalline growths surged toward them like a living wave, but they held their ground. Now, Luke commanded. Damien's finger stabbed down on the activation control. The beacon erupted with light so intense it turned the transformed bridge pure white. The communication array outside the station flared like a newborn star as 17 seconds of maximum power transmission burned through every circuit, every relay, every quantum entanglement core. The entity's scream came from everywhere at once. Not a sound, but a vibration that passed through their bones, their thoughts, their souls. The crystalline growths recoiled as if burned, retreating into the walls, the floor, the ceiling. For 17 seconds, humanity's story blazed across the galaxy at faster-than-light speeds, carrying their warning to every corner of known space. Then the transmission ended, the beacon died, and the great silence returned, but it was no longer perfect, no longer complete. The transmission lasted exactly 17 seconds. In that brief span of time, Relay Station Hermes broadcast across every frequency, every quantum channel, flooding the galaxy with the story of humanity's last stand. The beacon burned through its power cells, overloaded the communication array, and died in a shower of sparks that might have been mistaken for stars. Then silence returned, deeper and more complete than before. Damien Vega floated in his emergency pod, watching the station shrink in the distance. The entity had ejected them at the moment of transmission, not from mercy, but from a desire to preserve the station's systems. They were no longer needed as curators. Their purpose had been served and discarded. Luke's pod had failed during ejection, its life support systems corrupted by crystalline growth. He had died as he lived, following his duty to the end. Molly's pod had lasted 3 days before something that looked like starvation but felt like despair finally claimed her. Now Damien drifted alone in the space between stars, his pod's beacon flashing steadily into the void. The entity had allowed him to keep it, perhaps as a final cruelty, letting him call for help that would never come. But sometimes, in the deep quiet of his dying pod, he thought he heard something in the static. Faint and far away, like an echo of an echo, came sounds that might have been words. Voices speaking in languages he didn't recognize, but with inflections that seemed almost familiar. Other species, perhaps. Other civilizations that had received their warning beacon and learned from humanity's fate. Or maybe just his mind, finally breaking under the weight of absolute solitude. It didn't matter. The silence between stars was no longer perfect, no longer complete. Somewhere in the galaxy's spiral arms, their story lived on. Their voices, their final defiant act, had joined the cosmic background radiation that permeated all of space. The entity had harvested humanity, but it couldn't harvest the idea of humanity. That would spread from star to star, carried by species they had never met, warning of the silence that waited in the dark between thoughts. Damien closed his eyes and listened to the static, and in it he heard something that might have been his daughter's voice, asking him to bring her a star. He opened his emergency beacon one final time and spoke into it, his words joining the endless conversation of the cosmos. "Sarah," he whispered, "I brought you all of them." The beacon's light faded, and Damien Vega joined the great silence. But somewhere, in the space between words, in the pause between heartbeats, in the gap between one thought and the next, humanity's story continued to whisper its warning to anyone willing to listen. The silence spreads. But so do the words we speak against it. And in the depths of space, something that had consumed galaxies felt the first tremor of uncertainty in its perfect, ordered quiet. For the first time since it had begun its harvest of voices, it wondered if silence truly was the natural state of the universe. Or if perhaps, in the space between the stars, the greatest truth was not what went unspoken, but what brave souls dared to say into the endless dark. The beacon's light died, but the signal traveled on, racing toward distant suns where other eyes might see it, other minds might understand, other voices might take up humanity's final, defiant song. We were here. We lived. We spoke against the silence. Remember us.